Good day, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Untold Truth, the podcast where we literally punch racism in the face. Today is an amazing and exciting day for us. Today we have a very close friend and important person for South Africa that we will be talking to. It will be related to a book. We review the books here as well. The book we are looking at today is Verwoerd, My Journey Through Family Betrayals. And today we will be talking to the author of this book, who is none other than Wilhelm Verwoerd. So Wilhelm is a senior researcher and facilitator at the Center for the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest at Stellenbosch, also known as AVREC. As a white Afrikaans-speaking South African, a former researcher within the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission between 95 and 98, and a peace practitioner in Northern Ireland in 2001 and 2012. Wilhelm is devoted to rehumanization in the context of deep political division. His main research interests include the shared historical responsibility of white South Africans for apartheid and colonialism, and the dynamics of deep racial repair. A recently published memoir for Verwoerd, My Journey Through Family Betrayals, focuses on what it means for him to be committed to real reconciliation and to be a grandson of the architect of apartheid, Dr. H.F. Verwoerd. So with that intro, Wilhelm, welcome. Hello.
Hello, Edwin, and thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving up your time. We normally take an hour with these podcasts. If we do run over today, it will obviously be because we have some very, very critical topics that we need to discuss. And so we don't have a lot of time. And so we jump into this quickly and consciously. Wilhelm, as I introduced you, it says in your introduction and your bio that you are the grandson of Hendrik Verwoerd, also known as the architect of apartheid. Obviously, heavy burden to carry, and you, in the end, chose not to carry the family work as it is known in your own life and that of your children and your extended family that you have contact with. You then decide, I need to write a book about my grandfather and the relationship that we have and how it's related to the South Africa that you saw for yourself and the South Africa that you want to live in. Why was it necessary for you to write this book?
No, thank you, Edwin. Yeah, that was, it's the kind of book you're afraid to write, because you know that you're entering deep water territory. I think through my work that I'm now doing, but also over many years, I've become aware of this need for us to grapple with the sins of the fathers and the grandfathers, if we don't want those sins to be transmitted to our children and our grandchildren. So this idea that pain from the past, which is not transformed, will be transmitted, which comes from a kind of Jungian Richard Rohr perspective. And that's been a guiding almost principle in my life, that within my lifetime, within whatever I can do, I need to be willing to face the pain that I am connected with, the historical, political, systemic pain, obviously coming with this family connection, my own involvement, not just my grandfather, and to be able to face that painful truth so that we can find ways together of not transmitting that. And that only became possible from the mid-80s onwards through the willingness of people like yourself, Edwin, other people like Tsepiso Mashinini, people like Sam Porno, people like Themba Lonzi recently, people like the colleague that I'm working with closely, Prof. Pumla Gabode Madikizela and Ayanda Nyoka. I mean, I can keep on naming names, but it's really through almost the willingness of Black South Africans to engage with me, to journey with me, that I've been given this energy and encouragement to say, don't run away from who you are. Face it, and together we can change this inherited legacy. And for me, the book was then another step on that journey. with the hope really that it would contribute to white work. I wrote the book in Afrikaans first, and eventually it was translated into English. But I had the strong sense that people within the Afrikaans-speaking white community in particular, and especially people from my generation, but even our children, are struggling to face the past and the way in which the past is still present. And I was hoping that this kind of more autobiographical family story would be helpful in that regard.
Yeah. No, and I think you did justice to how you wrote the book because it's easy to read. It's well put together, and it gives us a sense of connection to a world that we would otherwise not have been engaged with. And I think obviously for a lot of family members, it might have been difficult. You stepping onto that scene and using that to expose some of your personal feelings towards a family that is infamous in South Africa. But I think for us and for me personally, when I read it, and I remember quite clearly when you gave me the book. We shared a hotel room for an afternoon after our flights to Johannesburg, and we needed some time to rest. You came to my room and handed me that book that time. And ever since, it was just amazing having that book and understanding a lot more about that relationship. But I think one of the key tenets that stood out for me in that book was you, to some extent, it sounded like you were trying to humanize a person in the form of your grandfather, Hendrik, that a lot of people associated with being a monster.
Mm.
And you try to humanize him as just your grandfather, Opa.
Mm.
Did you manage to humanize him on this journey, whether it's
Yeah,
through the book or where you are now? Have you been able to achieve that?
yes, I mean, I'm committed to radical humanization, so that has to include everybody. But in his case, it has been and continues to be very difficult, I have to say. And not just him, other members of my family too. There are days where I just become so angry and I just feel I just want to distance myself. But I think that's a cop out. I cannot, distance myself. He's in me genetically, at least, but also in my early socialization and my support of his policies when I was a young person. So I cannot, just deny that. And I think I've been shaped by many years of working in Northern Ireland, specifically with people who were involved in the violence, people from ex-paramilitary backgrounds, state backgrounds, but especially people from paramilitary backgrounds who were often demonized in their communities, on the loyalist Protestant side in particular. And I've been really on this journey with a close friend called Alistair Little, who really taught me the danger of demonizing others, because the demonization becomes a form of distancing. And that it's actually much more scary when we see that the people who do this kind of violence and who even advocate these ideologies are also human beings. It actually makes it much more confronting and challenging. And that I need to step into that role and say, if I was in his position, I would have done the same. And that's a very uncomfortable place to go. It's so convenient now to look back and, to try and distance ourselves. So for me, that was an important consideration. The other influence was, again, the work in Northern Ireland and Ireland included many, many, many workshops where we were doing storytelling. So people from different parts of the conflict were invited into a circle. And without political agreement, we said there needs to be a space where we can hear each other's human stories so that we begin to grapple with the big questions that divide us. And I increasingly started to ask myself the question, would I be willing to have that kind of circle with somebody like my grandfather? Would I actually be willing to listen to his story? And a part of me said no. But another part was saying, well, then you don't have integrity as a facilitator. You need to create space for people, even if you deeply disagree with their position. And so that's really what influenced the writing of the book. And I then came across this diary that my grandmother kept. which I wasn't aware of. And it was a diary that she kept during the time when he was prime minister, and especially for a number of years after he was assassinated. In that diary, and especially in the kind of mourning section of the diary, where she deeply mourns the loss of somebody that she loved, she talks about their student days, how they met each other. She talked about the family stuff with emotion, and with tears, and something in that opened a door in my heart, I suppose. And I found myself sort of through her eyes beginning to see a kind of a human person, because he's not published anything personal. He's not. It's almost impossible to get into his inner world if you look at what he has published. His kind of political speeches. It's almost like it's not surprising that people can't relate to him as a human being. Obviously because of the consequences of his policies as well, but I found a way through that diary, and through my grandmother, who I knew. I mean, I knew her until into the 90s, and she always accepted me in the family, even though I joined the ANC, even though I was very critical. She was one of the few people in the family who always said, no, as long as what you do is based on your principles and your convictions, that's what I care about, and you are still welcome in this family, which was different to my father and some other members in the family. So I have a kind of a warmth and an affection towards her. And I suppose through her eyes, he came alive in a way that actually, ironically, through his death and the way she mourned his death, he came alive for me. And at the same time, as I was writing that section of the book, I was very worried that this kind of humanizing would become a kind of excusing or a kind of justification, and that people might misunderstand what I'm trying to do. So while I was working through that diary, I also was asking my neighbor, Emily Mabiba, who's an older Black woman in the village where I live, and she's in her 70s at the time when I was writing the book. And I sat down with her and asked her to tell me about her childhood, tell me about your story of growing up in the 50s and the 60s, and what were your associations with Verwoerd and the people in the Afrikaner apartheid state. And I thought that if I can combine those two stories and sit with that tension, then perhaps I might avoid the pitfall of humanizing that becomes a kind of excusing. And I actually ended up with the conclusion that I cannot reconcile those two stories,
Wow.
that there's an irreconcilable tension between the lived experience of the majority of people in this country and the lived experience of people like my father, my family, my grandfather, and that I need somehow to sit with that tension and not try and avoid that discomfort.
Wow. That is a revelation that must be very difficult to utter, as somebody who obviously hold your family dear to your heart. I think I like the way you have worked through that, because one of the key moments in what you just said now that stands out for me is the significant role and critical role that grandmothers play,
Mm,
and also mothers and women in our lives play a significant role in humanizing, pardon, humanizing a lot of the experiences,
mm,
characteristics, and uh, human behavior that we show, that's endearing, loving, and kind towards others. And quite significantly in our struggle for justice and for humanization and for dignity, it's often the male perpetrators that has the significant hand, even though the women also benefit from the spoils of those actions. It's more so from the males. And so it's interesting that your grandmother would then make him, or make your grandfather, look more human because she has the closest contact to him. So
mm,
that just, it's a picture that it's interesting to understand. In saying that, uh, he remains the person he is, and you rightly say you can't reconcile that too. So now I'm going to put you on the spot and ask a very, it might be a difficult question. I don't know. When I wrote the question down, I thought it would be a difficult question, but I don't know how you will experience this. Looking at all of that, writing the book, working through the historical artifacts of who your grandfather was and is for most Black people in South Africa. If you had to say, do you think that you love him or loved him or loved
Mm.
some of him? Or is there any emotion connected to how we understand love for a grandparent or somebody close to you, a close relative? Do you feel any of that type of emotion toward him?
Yeah, that is a good question. Thank you, Edwin. I mean, I think because I was only 2 years old when he was assassinated in 1966, I never knew him personally. And I sometimes wish that I was a bit older and that I had a chance to get to know him, or that he lived longer. Although probably then he would have had an even bigger influence on my life. But so I grew up with not knowing him, but always being surrounded by people in my family and in the Afrikaans-speaking white community, and especially older people who expressed a lot of admiration for him. And always, a number of times people would say, you should be so proud of this wonderful, folks leader, and that he gave his life for our community and our cause. So pride was a strong emotion. And later, of course, once I became exposed to what really happened and what he represents as the kind of personification of the system, it was a relationship filled with shame, and wanting to almost like deny my connection with him. And so gradually over time, I realized I can't do that. I need to work through it and sort of accept that this is the genealogy where I come from, and that a quarter of my genes, if I'm not mistaken, actually is him in me. And if I don't accept that, then I'm also actually reducing my own potential to become who I'm meant to be in my lifetime. And so the language of love is a word that I would not have used, but something did happen during the writing of the book, and I didn't feel emotionally connected to him because I was so angry often about what he represents, and I'm still committed to deal with the legacy of his policies and the many people who supported him. But when my grandmother, in her diary, she writes in detail about what happened on the day that he was assassinated. And this is now months into the sitting with the book. I went specifically to the family house in Betty's Bay, where he's got a family house. I went into his study. I took pictures down from the wall and I put it in front of me, at eye height. I have a picture of me as a little baby sitting on his lap, where he's feeding me with a milk bottle. I was reading her diary, and when I came to that part of the diary, I actually became emotional. It was so it caught me by surprise that a part of me started to feel sad with her about the way he was killed and what he represented. And I thought, wow, this is the first time I'm actually feeling this kind of emotional connection. Um, and so there's a kind of tenderness, I suppose, that comes with humanization, a kind of sense of emotional connection. I'm not sure if I can use the word love in a strong sense, but a kind of an acknowledgement of a deep connection and a sense of tragedy almost about how he became so immersed in the cause of the Afrikaners following what we called the Anglo-Boer War, or the South African War, and that he was so passionate about this kind of Afrikaner cause. And of course, I can resonate with that because I grew up with this thing about, Afrikaners suffered under the hands of the British imperialists and the English and the
Yeah.
Rooineke, et cetera, et cetera. So when I go into that wavelength, I connect with him. But the moment I then move away and I then say, okay, well, let's look at what was the impact on the wider community. I sit down with you, I sit down with so many of my colleagues here at the university, and you just hear the pain that's evoked by that name even today. And
Yeah.
and then I have to say, oh my goodness, I mean, then a part of me wants to hate him. And then I also realize, that's a dangerous emotion because it can become one where I distance myself too much.
Yeah.
So it's a conflicted love-hate relationship, I think, would be a way to summarize my response to your question.
It's actually a perfect response, because I think I can hear in the way you jump through the two worlds of love and hate. It is clear that you are sitting with a lot of conflict in terms of the emotion that you hold towards your grandfather. But you've mentioned multiple times now in this conversation the assassination, and so obviously we have to go to that. We know that he was assassinated in his office, stabbed by what the person
Defenders.
called Chavendas, yeah. Um, and my question to you is another. So today I'm bringing a few difficult ones, Valalan.
That's
So
okay.
you grabbing all the difficult ones today. As an activist for the rehumanization of Black people and fighting for justice and dignity in this country, which you have done for many decades now, do you find yourself viewing Chafendas and his action as a hero for the struggle and for justice?
Mhm.
Or
Mm,
do you see him as a murderous criminal
mm.
in terms
Yeah, you
of
see,
how you
yeah,
place him
yeah.
today?
No, I mean, obviously, when I grew up, his name was mentioned, but he was always treated as mentally insane, or mentally like he was insane when he committed that deed. So that was a very convenient way to distance ourselves from the political intention with his actions. And it was during the TRC when I was working as a researcher that somebody brought a whole portfolio of information that acknowledged some of his mental challenges, but also painted a very clear picture of somebody who was politically motivated
Mm,
and who suffered a lot within his own experience, within his own family, through the racial classification system and the whole system. So that was my first confrontation. And then recently there was this extensive book that was written by I don't remember the name now, but kind of a detailed biography of Dimitri Tsafendas. Again, making a very strong case that this was a politically motivated assassination. Um, and I also remember how, for me, one of the transformative moments has been during the 80s when people like Tepiso Mashinini and others were saying to me how on the day that he was assassinated, they ran into the streets and they celebrated. You know, I grew up with stories of a mass funeral. I mean, if you see the pictures of the state funeral, hundreds of thousands of people in Pretoria. It's unbelievable, the scale of that funeral. And so often people, when I grew up, would stop and then ask me how I am and talk about my grandfather. And then soon they would say where they were on the day he was assassinated. Like this memory is etched in their minds. And it would have been within the Afrikaner community a day of great sadness. So for me, it became this transformative challenge to say, actually, oh my goodness, this was a day of celebration and liberation because this person who was the man of granite, you know, this kind of immovable ideological personification of a very powerful system in the 60s, especially. So for me then to say, actually, no, I part of me increasingly is starting to understand why people celebrate it. And that, I mean, I'm not sure if I would go as far as being able to say he's a hero for me. I think that's probably a step too far. But I do acknowledge and see the political significance of his motivation and also the importance of that event. Um, Within the transition towards, I don't know, I suppose we then move towards a security state and we actually, I don't know, how to interpret what would have happened if he stayed on longer. But clearly there was this sense of deep liberation, and a part of me, wants to acknowledge that, and I definitely don't want to be part of this criminalizing mental insanity discourse around offenders.
yeah. Um, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer how difficult it is for you to maneuver yourself through these two worlds, where
Yeah.
being a Verwoerd and connected to the family, and the family name, which you unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it today, in hindsight, cannot shake because it was what you were born into. And so now you're sitting in this other world where you have had significantly amazing relationship with Black people that have welcomed you into our world and then imparted into you this concept of Ubuntu, where we're building as brothers and as sisters in one nation. So I see how that plays itself off against each other the whole time. And then it jumps over to, so we understand now that the book generally speaks about your relationship, the humanization or the attempted humanization of your grandfather. But the closest link in your life, because as you mentioned, you were very young when your grandfather was assassinated. So the closest link to your grandfather that you grew up with in your house was your parents, and the type of ideology and upbringing that they then brought into the house of what they were brought up with. So can you speak a little bit, because you've mentioned that as well? It's very interesting, all the questions that is coming up. You already touched on them, and so it's like we're in sync with where we're going with this. But you've spoken about the ideology in the Afrikanerdom of how your grandfather and your father
Mm.
uh, lived and understood the world through their lenses. How is that relationship, or was that
Thank
relationship
you.
with your
Yeah,
father,
no.
and how does it look today?
Mm. Can I just, as a footnote to the previous conversation or the previous question, just say that one of the key moments during the 80s, as I was becoming more and more politically aware, and as I was engaging with Black students and colleagues in England where I was studying, one of the important things that people said to me was, do not run away from who you are. In our culture, we respect our ancestors. He's
Mm,
your grandfather. But that's different from him being also the prime minister and the architect of apartheid. So it's almost like my ability to accept him as my grandfather has been mediated by Black South Africans, which is a bit
mm,
ironic, but that has become one of the almost invitations and permissions almost for me to also claim him as an ancestor and a grandfather.
mm,
My father, I think, is in a it's a very difficult relationship, and it's become extremely difficult again after the book, because he is the oldest male figure within the family. So he's the oldest child of 7. And when my grandfather was assassinated, he took on the role of representing the family with my grandmother, but also being the male figure. Now he becomes the kind of spokesperson for the family. And he's continued to take on that role of almost protecting, uh, uh, honoring the legacy of his father. And my own sort of hunch is that part of this is because there wasn't really a space during that time for them to work through the trauma of that death. It became this kind of religiously inspired, it was God's will or whatever, but it was also became this kind of martyr type sacrifice. But there was no space to really work through the impact within the family of losing his father. And I think this kind of holding on, this almost like excessive loyalty from my point of view, and then this kind of patriarchal role of being the oldest male figure within the family has meant that he's basically chosen loyalty and love for his father above loving his son. So when I challenged his father, when I publicly, from his point of view, shame the family, dishonor the sacrifice that his father made, he cannot accept that. And from the 90s, this became for him very important to publicly distance himself from my position. We figured out a way while I was in Ireland to sort of say, okay, we agree to disagree, and that he thought I was moving away from my strong political position. But when the book came out, he again just felt this is another layer of shaming, and he just cannot accept it. So there's a complete breakdown in that relationship again. And I've come to the point that I cannot explain to him, I cannot convince him. I mean, it's such a strong conviction that he has. And a part of me wants to be empathetic in terms of him loving his father, so, but it's the way in which the personal then became interwoven with the political, and I need to understand that. The important figure actually during the writing of the book, but if I look back in my life and in deep conversations during the writing of the book, has become my mother. And it's again how I tend to focus so much on the grandfather and on the father figure. But my mother has become, over many years, she's been a very important figure because she has the same politics. But at a personal level, she's much more of a warm people person. Also, the way she interacts across the color division or the racial division. At that individual level, there's a lot of um, uh, empathy, human kind of interaction. And her father was just a teacher in a kind of a small town, in what was called Western Transvaal. And she told me a story of a child of color who was born from the illicit relationship between a farmer's daughter and a farm worker. And this child ended up in the school, and the parents, the white parents, Afrikaner parents, wanted to get rid of this child and said he shouldn't be there. But my grandfather on my mother's side apparently insisted that this child had to get an education. And for her, it was a sign that he had this kind of compassion at that human level. And she believes that from the 4 children, I've got 3 siblings, that I've come across much more like him than some of my brothers. So I think there's a very interesting story to be explored in my own understanding of my family connection on my mother's side. And her in particular, I feel quite close to her in terms of personality and approach. So I think she's actually been a very important person. And she's got to the point where she never rejected my family membership. And she's also now at the point, I think, where they're 95, they're still with us, too old now to have really deep conversations. But I think she's basically almost like come to the point where she would reject that kind of idolizing of my grandfather, and would actually challenge my father in terms of not choosing his father above his child. So she's become a very important person.
Yeah, there's so much in that statement that I want to grab onto and speak to. So I have time in my mind, but I so desperately want to say something about everything, but I have to manage that. So first and foremost, so you said earlier that there's about 25% of your grandfather from your father's side inside of you. So I take it the other 75% is now your grandfather from your mother's side. So knowing you as a compassionate person, I understand now a little bit where that comes from. And I think those listening to us will also understand that. But again, you come back to the fact that your mother has played a significant role in the humanizing the dignity and the love that you share with others, even across the racial barriers. So it makes an important point, and I always say this, and I am an advocate for this in my work, that white women play a significant role in the transformation of South Africa. And I think a lot more white women should take up that position as the beacons of hope that will help. I'm not saying that they are the Jesus of transformation. I'm just saying that they play a significant role in how they transform men and the way they are. And I think in your case, it's very significant that you highlight those females in your life, your grandmother, your mother, but also the elderly lady that you spoke to in the village and others,
Yeah.
Pumla, people like that. They played a significant role in the humanizing of yourself coming from where you come from. So that is an important point that I want to highlight. But also in your life, you ended up marrying Milani, who was your female hope or pillar of hope that then guided you to an also clearer understanding. How did that come about, and how do you place that in your life,
Yeah.
in the role that she played?
Yeah, she didn't come from the same kind of conservative Afrikaner background, obviously from an Afrikaner background, but politically, her family were not that impressed when we got together, and was worried that she would end up being more conservative. But she challenged me from the start. And then as we were going through our student political awakening period, where I was able to send her information from Holland and from England, banned literature that was not available in the 80s. And so we went together on that journey of political, I suppose, awakening. But then she was much more of an activist. And so when we came back in the early 90s, she joined the ANC before me. She became more actively involved. And that was an important contribution to my hesitant eventual willingness to go against the family in public and join the ANC. And then we continued with our work, and she became much more of the political activist person, and I became involved with the TRC and the behind the scenes kind of work. Yeah, so she's been an important person on that journey.
Yeah, so I think that's also a critical point that you highlight there, the significant role that she played, and attaching it to my statement previously that white women have this significant role to play. So it just reinforces that the thinking is real, that there is a significant role for white people or white females to play in this transformation of South Africa. You've touched multiple times, you speak in the book about it, um, and you speak about the influence that people like Alistair has had on your life. The conflict in Ireland, it has been ongoing, and it continues to rear its ugly head because it's going on again now where there's a lot of conflict. What initiated the conflict? Did you manage to achieve the goals that you were set out or setting out to achieve when you were there and working there? And how do you think we have come to this place where if we take South Africa and an Ireland and put the two together, how we constantly revert back to this type of need for a civil war in order to get us to our next level?
Yeah, so when I arrived in Ireland in 2001, people were still very interested in South Africa, very interested in the TRC process in particular, because they were going through a very important transition at that time where they managed to sort of agree politically not to pursue their different constitutional goals violently. The big difference between South Africa and Ireland, Northern Ireland at that time, was that South Africa had a political constitutional settlement, and we were struggling at the kind of socio-economic political level to translate that settlement into a genuine transition. They were not succeeding at the kind of political constitutional level, but they were investing much more in terms of community-based justice work and relational work. And so ironically, I was spending time in Ireland in a lot of behind the scenes community-based dialogue, reconciliation and peace work. And at that time, people in South Africa were not doing that work to the same degree. We almost like thought, okay, we've arrived, the ANC is in power, we've had the TRC, we actually, churches and civil society and other groups, I think, stepped back and stopped the need for this very important ongoing relational structural work that has to be done at a community level. So I learned in Northern Ireland and Ireland, I learned, just how much energy and time and resources are required if we're serious about bridging deep historical divides. Not only at the relational level, but doing the relational work as a kind of preparation and support for the institutional and the structural. We made some progress. I mean, I recently met somebody who became quite a prominent educator in that setting and talked about how much that work meant for her in her life during that 10-year period. I do hear sometimes from people, even now, that they talk with appreciation of the work we did. But a lot of this dialogue, storytelling, behind the scenes work, it's not easy to show what difference does it make in terms of the big picture. But that's the point of entry I chose and wanted to learn how to, at the very concrete human level, how do we bring people together? Now the challenge, of course, both in Ireland and Northern Ireland and in South Africa, is that that's not enough. We can't only focus on the relational. We need to find ways to address the structural and the systemic. And that's where they are deadlocked, I think. I mean, they are really struggling at a political level. And that's why you keep on getting this tensions rising with Brexit and with other developments. With us, we do have the settlement, but people are becoming more and more disillusioned with that. And the socioeconomic inequalities are just much, much, much worse here than they are there. And we don't have the kind of EU context within which they're able to contain their conflict. We are faced with a much, much bigger transgenerational question of ongoing apartheid, you know.
Yeah, and that's interesting to understand that distinction, because we sometimes hear about this conflict, but we don't have great insight into how that conflict need to be understood into our personal experience here in South Africa. So thank you for just shedding some light on that. But I just want to take 2 steps back. The TRC, as you said, island revered the process. And when we speak to a lot of people across the world, they speak about this amazing process where South Africa actually went through the TRC process and then subverted the war that should have happened at the end of apartheid. But a lot of South Africans, when asked, will tell you that the TRC was the cosmetic process that didn't actually have the impact. I personally also feel that way. Um, how do you feel about that, having been
Yeah.
part of the process? Where do you place it, and how should people look at it now?
Well, this is a big conversation, I suppose, on its own. But briefly, I would say I still feel there's a baby in the bath, you know, even though the bath water is very dirty. I'm worried that some of the ways we now look back at the TRC, that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use that metaphor. And I think our challenge even at that time was to convey what is it that we can realistically expect from the TRC. And I think it made some contribution to expose some of the violations took place. I think there was some acknowledgement, public acknowledgement, that took place. But the commission was almost set up to fail because it wasn't given the power to implement its recommendations around prosecution and reparation. So over time, the commission then was seen as a perpetrator-friendly, like you say, cosmetic activity. It was never intended to contribute to socioeconomic justice. I mean, that was supposed to happen through a number of other commissions, including the Land Commission, you know, the Gender Commission, etc. But because the TRC was so prominent and was so emotive in the stories that were exposed, I think people started to expect it to almost like reconcile South Africa. And it was never going to be possible. It always was going to have a limited contribution, and it was always going to be important for civil society, the state. And I mean, the irony is that the ANC government became alienated from the TRC because the TRC also made findings of human rights violations against the ANC in their camps, you know, the torture and the killings that took place there. So because of this political alienation between the TRC trying to be a human rights orientated, you know, commission of inquiry, and the government, there was very little political will to implement the recommendations of the TRC. So I think one should place it within that bigger picture.
Yeah.
When I look back, I think the biggest regret I have is that we didn't start with the institutional hearings. So most people, when they think of the TRC, they don't even remember that we had a whole series of hearings looking at the role of the judiciary, the media, the business community, faith communities, you know, the health sector. And those took place about 2 years into the process. By then, most people have decided that the TRC was about Black victims and white perpetrators, getting amnesty and Black victims sharing their suffering, but not getting much in return for that. And that's still the perception of the TRC. But if you go to the report, and there's a whole volume, volume 4, that I wish we can make more prominent and almost revisit. Because if that was the starting point for the commission and we were able to continue with that kind of institutional systemic focus, I think we would have made it more difficult for white South Africans in particular to say, no, we don't have anything to do with those violations. It was Eugene de Kock and company. You know, we didn't really paint this picture of a system with so many strands to it that made those violations possible, and that all white South Africans in particular, and not only white, unfortunately, but let me focus on white, that we are implicated and that we are beneficiaries from that system. And that's the kind of educational opportunity that was missed. So that we are now struggling with young white South Africans who do not see themselves as beneficiaries of systemic injustice, who do not see as kind of a shared responsibility. And I think the TRC had the potential to shift a kind of legalistic understanding of responsibility, which has its place. But we need a broader understanding of systemic shared historical responsibility. And I still think we should go back to that volume 4, and we should have many more institutional hearings, for example, also here at Stellenbosch University and other places, to really face the way in which the past is still present, and
Yeah.
then find a way to translate that awareness into concrete restitutional responsibility,
Mm.
which we are struggling with, even at Stellenbosch.
Yeah, I think you have significantly piqued my interest. So I will definitely go back to chapter 4 of the
Volume
TRC
4.
report, volume 4. And anybody listening to this, I think it's time we start looking at that, because Willem is making a critical point. And that's why we're struggling to uproot the remnants of apartheid in our social society, because of the systemic and institutional depth and the roots that have been thrown in there, and specifically, like you mentioned, at Stellenbosch University. But it also, again, it links to the following question I have, which is, there's a lot of institutions that played a significant role in supporting apartheid, and continuing the oppression and the divide amongst people in South Africa. And now we speak about the Dutch Reformed Church and their responsibility. You being a peace builder, you've been trying to bring the two worlds together for a very long time. And I have been part of these processes on and off. And my question is, do you feel, having done all that you've been doing, and what have been happening in the church, do you feel that the Dutch Reformed Church have done enough in terms of undoing their responsibility and their part that they played in apartheid? And how do you view their role if you feel they have not done enough?
Yes, no, thank you. I have to say, Edwin, I'm very encouraged by some of the younger people that I've been privileged to work with within the Dutch Reformed Church setting. So I think there's a generational kind of openness and a willingness to face things. But the church itself, I think, is still dominated by an older generation of white Afrikaner men, who come from my kind of generation, who I think are really struggling to really face the past that we come from. I mean, at a formal level, the Dutch Reformed Church has done quite a bit in terms of policies and kind of statements. But I think the translation of that awareness at a congregational level, if you go into a local congregation and you're faced with a reality that in many congregations, it's still a large white majority Afrikaans speaking congregation. Those young people are talking to me and sharing with me how they are struggling to operate in that space, because the almost like the sociological legacy, the kind of the separateness, and this kind of white majority Afrikaans speaking enclaves created by those congregations are very powerful defenses almost against facing up to our responsibility and taking on a social justice orientated engagement, not paternalistic charity.
Mm.
So this kind of outreach culture, there's been a lot of that, and it has a role, and I do appreciate that it's better than nothing, I suppose. But from a social justice point of view, there is not, I think, enough acknowledgement of our historical role, the Dutch Reformed Church role. I'm technically still a member, so let me speak about myself as well. I'm not involved in a strong sense, but I am part of this. So we have this historical role. We are still at an institutional level living very segregated, congregational lives. And I think there's a lot of work we need to do to face that past, but to do it within a commitment to restitutional social justice. And I worry about the success of apartheid, the success of these segregated neighborhoods, segregated communities. Older people also have access to the resources, that make the life of the church possible. So a kind of disproportionate power that the older generation has. So the church then becomes almost like the Dutch Reformed Church becomes a microcosm of this kind of
Yeah.
ongoing generational sociological, theological kind of realities that are still plaguing us, you know.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And again, as you said, to the previous question, the TRC is a full conversation on its own that we probably need to have. And then the Dutch Reformed Church, again, it's a whole conversation all on its own. And I wanted to highlight and touch on some of the exclusionary practices that you have noted that has been taking place in the way the church have been set up in upholding, the apartheid view of separatism. And I was recently at the local church here in Somerset West with one of my friends that you also know, Skalk van Jerden, and he was specifically at a youth service where he spoke about our history, the past, and our future, and we dealt with issues of apartheid. The whole church body that was there of youth, and it was a significant, a good sized youth that was there. From grade 7 to about grade 12, so it's a big group, and he touched on a few issues of race and that and that. And then afterwards, a lot of the responses that we got was because he spoke about race to them, they felt that he's a racist and that he is coming to create problems for them in the church. And why must he talk about things like this? And so it shows us that even the church as an institution remain a stumbling block in our transformation, because these institutions, and therefore it becomes important to look at volume 4 and the role that these institutions play, because this is how the oppressive system of apartheid is kept alive, even though we claim that it has been overthrown or it ended in 1994. And one of those institutions then that links onto this, because now we're talking about schools. So we have some of these schools that are predominantly white schools, and one of them that you actually went to, and it's written about in the in the book. So Paul Roos Gymnasium has this rich history, but part of that history is the indoctrination of young white boys to have this polarizing idea of we have to be one nation, we have to out for our people, And so while the government have changed and we have a black government today, I think a lot of the culture and that which is transferred to kids in those spaces remains polarizing. Even though they have a
Absolutely.
few black students in the school now, that doesn't change the culture, because if you look at how they operate, they still operate as in the past. So Paul Roos, the Dutch Reformed Church, young people, these type of institutions, what are we going to do about that?
No, you are right, Edwin. I mean, I'm reminded of Jonathan Janssen's book, Knowledge in the Blood, you know.
Yeah.
And in that book, which was written based on his experiences at the University of Pretoria, he talks about how there are these ongoing, very powerful forces shaping young people. And these are the families that people grow up in, the friendship circles that people move in, the cultural organizations, but also the schools and the churches that people go to that tend to be white majority and in the Afrikaner context, Afrikaans speaking. And I think when you are socialized in that way, when you live in a neighborhood that's majority white Afrikaans speaking, or even just white, majority white school, majority white church, sport, etc., friendship circles, then those are very powerful ways to shape the way people look at the world. And that for me is the tragic success of apartheid, that at a sociological, spatial level, we still often live very separate lives, and that you don't have enough examples of equal, genuine friendships across the racial divides. And I've been blessed and privileged to, I suppose, to have these opportunities also where I work now. And again, I'm reminded, and I'm being challenged by people like my colleague Ayanda in New Yorker and other colleagues as well. You know, the kind of blind spots or the limited awareness that I have coming from this kind of socializing, coming from the dominant group, you know, as a white Afrikaner man, middle class, you know, heterosexual, you name it. I've got all those kind of identifications of being part of a dominant group. And they are just very limited. It's a very limiting way of looking at the world. So unless I have somebody that I can work with and who can challenge me and we can journey together, then I keep holding on to that. And that's why I do believe in the importance of white work, that white South Africans, Afrikaans speaking white South Africans in particular, we need to do much more work in terms of looking at our history, reading, being exposed to history from a different point of view, to our point of view. At the same time, we need to look for spaces where we can work together, cultivate authentic, equal relationships. Because my worry is that in these white majority schools, in the church, when there are interactions with people across the racial divide, it tends to be paternalistic, or it tends to be still majority minority. Um, and under those conditions, actually, it doesn't become transformative. You can still hold on to your comfortable dominant culture point of view. Or you can now paint yourself as this kind of threatened minority, to even hide the dominance that you still carry. So I that's why I still believe in the importance of relational cultivation across these divisions, but with a very clear commitment to social justice. And that's why I'm grateful that you are willing to have this conversation, because I think we need to continue across the big divisions where we come from to grapple. And we might disagree, but as long as we don't give up on each other, and as long as that I'm at least willing to do some of the work, that you don't have to do all the work, but that together we need to challenge you in particular, challenge people like me. But it's got to be part of a relational commitment. And for me, that's one of the sad things I realized in my own life, just that I grew up without genuine friendships or without genuine relationships across the racial divides. And I still think there's a kind of an illiteracy and a kind of a lack of trust, a lack of confidence in this ability for us to be really together. So I think that's why we need to spend time on the relational work, but obviously within a social justice framework. But some days when I look at also what's happening at Stellenbosch and in other places, it's easy to despair. And when you look at what's going on in the world in terms of this kind of right white nationalist backlash, and the Trumpism that's around the corner waiting for us again. So it's easy then for white South Africans to tie into that kind of reactionary international discourse, even in Europe, So there's a much bigger global challenge we face, but at the same time, we can take responsibility locally where we can.
Yeah. I think it's what you're highlighting is important facts that we need to look into, because it's that socialization through these institutions that claim to be powerless, but who are significantly powerful, and more so because they hold the economic and social power
Yes.
to veto a lot of these processes, and then make it look as if they are struggling to get by, or to survive in this culture of black danger and dominance, which is all nonsense. And it's just a narrative that we also see in our political parties being used to garner support from the international world, to say for recently the Democratic Alliance saying that we need observers for our election because it's going to be dangerous and all of that. And in the meantime, we've never had political violence, the type we saw in the pre-1994, where it was actually white aggression that brought on all the violence. So a lot of this is being used as political tools. So I agree with you 100%. I think you, as a perfect model that have come through these systems, shows us how it is influenced through family, through the media, through the social groups that you belong to the family members and close friends to the family that they hang out. It builds this concept of how the young white mind is shaped and formed to be more racist when it comes out to them reaching their not just puberty but also adulthood. And so then the unlearning starts, but it's so difficult because it's so deeply ingrained. And as you've shown now, you are literally, like I say, you are the perfect example. And it's actually crazy that it is, because Not really crazy because of where you come from, but because we now have this example to use Wilhelm as this is how it actually works, but also this is how it works when Wilhelm unlearns some of that and he can be contributing positively. So now we look at you. You come from a family that is pro-apartheid and was brought up in that, and you had that same consciousness. Then you went to a school like Paul Roos, where you were further indoctrinated in this idea of pro-Afrikaner, pro-white
Yeah.
concepts. Then you as a young child or young adult coming in through puberty, you then join the Broederbond youth wing that then influences you even more to become this. You should be the next Eugene Terblans based on your the exposure you had, and then you end up at Wilgenhof,
Mm.
who has been in the news and who is basically like an enclave that you've mentioned of the greatest Stellenbosch that hold those type of values and think that it's okay to hold that values because it speaks to our history of who we are as a nation and who we are as Afrikaners, that, you know, one folk, we must be together. So now you are this perfect example of all of that working together and building that ideology. And speaking to Wilgenhof, but also speaking to being that perfect example and how we then change that perfect example to somebody like who you are today, who stands for justice and who fights against the system of oppression.
Mm.
How does that two worlds look?
Well, yeah, I think for me, when I look back, we've mentioned a number of people's names. I think I've been very lucky in some ways, I suppose, to be able to study overseas in the mid-80s, to be almost like physically removed from the comfort zone or this kind of cocoon of white Afrikaner, Christian, Dutch Reformed Church piety, you know, and to be exposed viscerally to the life experiences of people on the receiving end of apartheid. So being able to get access to footage that was banned, like news footage, but also documentaries I saw while I was in England, books I was able to read, people I were able to meet. I think that became the watershed time of being confronted with a kind of truth that I just couldn't walk away from. And fortunately, I didn't have my friends and my family with me. So there was a sense in which I had to find a way, you know, and it was for 3 years. It wasn't just for a weekend. So it was an extended period of being confronted. And that also included some white South Africans who were much more progressive than I was, who also confronted me. And so I think the white work really happened also for me, that I was being confronted by black South Africans and by white South Africans. And together, because there was time and a bit away from these very powerful cocoon-like influences that I grew up in, that I think it shifted something that I couldn't unshift. You know, it had time to take root, so that when we came back to South Africa, it was possible then to become politically involved. But if I didn't have those kinds of networks of people who were journeying with me, challenging me, supporting me, encouraging me, on my own, I could not have done this. So I think it's very important to stress that, and that's still true up to today. That if it, even with what's happening now with Volchanov, you know, when I wanted to face and challenge and criticize what has been exposed, and also challenge myself for my own lack of awareness around some of that history, I was being supported by colleagues here in Afrika. And if it wasn't for that, I think to talk about myself as a recovering racist, as somebody who still has to do a lot of unlearning, is embarrassing. You know, it's a kind of shame that comes with facing your own complicity, your own implication in these violent systems, dehumanizing systems. And I thought Wilgenhof was relatively innocent in the sense it was more like Afrikaner tradition. It was men, you know, it was a kind of a, I didn't see it as part so strongly. I didn't see it as so strongly implicated in the racial dynamics as well. And so some of these disciplinary practices, some of the initiation practices that I relatively uncritically accepted, I'm now looking back and think, gosh, why did I not see some of this highly problematic racial connotations? Why was it that black students at Volgenhof had to challenge, you know, the clothing that was worn by the disciplinary committee or group with this kind of KKK connotation? what is it about these white majority spaces that we are not willing to see and listen to the experience of people who come from the receiving end of apartheid? And um, that for me is still, when I speak to young people and some of the students at Wilgenhof and see even some of the young white students, many of them don't have a kind of historical awareness. They don't see the connection between the exposures at Wilgenhof around this kind of violence of the initiation practices and the disciplinary practices. They don't see the connection between that and the urination scandal we had a few years ago. They don't see the connection between the urination scandal at Stellenbosch and what happened at Bloemfontein in 2008 with rates. They don't see the connections between this kind of historical, often masculine violence against people of color and violence towards ourselves, I suppose, through the kind of militarizing culture that we grew up in. So for me, that's very worrying that we have a generation of young people who are now at university with very limited historical awareness.
Mm,
And if you don't, and then they individualize. So they say, but I'm not a racist. And they start to tell stories about their friends and so, and it's all about attitude and about individualized, not being a racial racist. But we don't see how it's part of these institutions and it's part of the
mm,
traditions that we've inherited over generations, and which is then linked to the system within which Black South Africans say we are struggling to breathe.
mm,
I don't struggle to breathe in this space, but how does it mean? What does it mean? What is it about Stellenbosch, about Porus, about South Africa that many Black South Africans resonate so strongly with the Black Lives Matter movement in the States? Of
mm.
like we are struggling to breathe in this space, even though we have political power, at least in principle. That's not the experience on the ground, and that I think is the wake-up call that I feel at the moment. I'm now more and more committed to do work within Stellenbosch University. The university has a restitution statement from 2018 that many people don't know about. I didn't know about it till I was alerted to this by a Black colleague, Zetu Mkhize. And together with Ayanda and with other colleagues, we are now trying to say to white colleagues, white students, what does it mean to accept the contribution of this institution to past injustices? How have we excluded individuals and communities? What were the privileges that we were given as a result of our inclusion? How are these continued? And what does it then mean to commit ourselves to restitutional inclusivity?
Mm.
And that's the process that I'm now putting most of my time and energy in, and it's localized, but it does feel like it's an important symbolic site to be doing this work.
Yeah,
And it's very confronting, often overwhelming, but also, you find people in different places within the university doing important transformative work. And at least we are having the conversation with ourselves. We are not denying this like the UCTs and the WITS, these kind of liberal
yeah, yeah,
universities thinking where we've arrived, but at least we are now seriously facing things that in some ways hopefully will spill over into the broader
yeah,
white South Africa.
yeah. I think that that's important. I think as a student and a person that works a lot with Stellenbosch University, yourself being there, I think we all experience a significant pressure of suppression that still permeates the space, specifically for Black people. And I think somebody like myself, who, as you know, and as many know, I'm very militant and direct, and that is still something that is unacceptable. The idea of decency or ordentlikheid that
Mm,
permeates the concepts and ideology of white Afrikaners, that you have to speak nicely and you have to come with a loving demeanor if you want to affect lasting change. So I think there is a need for a deliberate intention within spaces like Stellenbosch and Paul Roos, where they actively allow people of different ideology, concepts, ideas to engage robustly in order to change some of the systems there. I also think that some of the institutional heads remain part of the pillar of upholding oppression and the remnants of apartheid within the Stellenbosch universities and the Paul Roos's. There's more institutions, obviously. And we have to come together as a unit because we need multiple people, whether we, like you say, You said earlier, would you be a good facilitator if you don't allow all voices in that room? And we need all voices in the room, even the opposing ones that's far right and those who are on the left. But the goal and the concept behind all of this is to come out with a type of solution that will finally undo the gains and the constant oppression of Black people, and then the reintegration that goes with the reparations and the transition where Black people feel compensated in some way, but where the system becomes a little bit more equal, where we have a voice of our own and where we don't feel, because this is what a lot of people say at Stellenbosch University, if you speak up loudly and you speak your mind, they will come for you, they will target you. So that still exist. Like, for example, when you look at the Vulcan of the investigation going on there, it's a certain group of people that was elected. Is a certain a group of alumni that is funding, keeping these things under wraps so that is not exposed, and so that they can hold on to that dark history that actually Black people are heavily negatively affected by, So those are some of the things that I think if we continue talking more, we can sustain in dialogue and then get to some point where we can actually figure out us not going into a civil war. But we are running out of time so fast, and I just want to talk more and more and more, and we don't have time. So I'm going to wind us down to the end, and I want to ask you, as a big supporter of the ANC in the early 80s, late 90s, we are now at this, some people would want us to believe that it is this watershed moment where we're going to vote in a similar fashion to 1994, which I obviously don't agree with. But we are now coming into an election. You supported the ANC previously. It's so difficult to decide who to vote for. I personally don't know who I'm going to vote for, because the political ideologies of the political parties in this country has left us all probably with nothing much to say about them in terms of their contribution to our current situation. So if you had to give some advice on on how to choose somebody to vote for in the upcoming election, how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, thank you, Edwin. It is a tricky question, especially for me as a white South African who openly supported the ANC in the 90s. I often say that I feel I'm still a member of that movement that I joined in the early 90s. I'm not sure, and in fact, I'm actually quite sure that the current government no longer represents that movement. That the current ANC has lost that kind of vision and integrity that I felt was still there, perhaps naively, even at that time. But so I feel I want to look for a party that's the closest possible to that kind of vision that the kind of radical inclusivity and South Africa becoming a home for all who live here, with a kind of social justice awareness. So I'm looking for a party that's the closest to that vision. And for me, the current ANC no longer represents that vision. So I also don't feel like I can vote for them anymore, but I don't want to distance myself from the movement and the need for people like myself to stay loyal and true to that movement. And I know that non-racial vision is a tricky one, and that we talk about anti-racism now, but I think there's still something profound about that non-racial charterist tradition if we take it seriously. And that anti-racism is a movement in the service of that larger vision. But which party actually comes the closest, I'm not sure. And I've chosen to spend my energy more in a civil society setting, and sometimes have lost confidence in our political institutional settlement. But I was married to a politician for a number of years, and I also know that this kind of cynicism about politics is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that there are good people. There are people within the ANC, within different parties, within the government, who are committed. And I don't want to just feed uncritically into this culture of cynicism about all politicians and all parties, because I know how difficult it is when you try to do something good on the inside, when you're faced with that kind of cynicism. And we drive those people away then through our cynicism. But at the same time, we have to be critical and take on. I think for me, what we're trying to do at Stellenbosch is increasingly to say, what does institutional citizenship involve? what does democratic citizenship involve? What is my responsibility to be part of this transition, and not wait for the institutional leadership, or for the ANC for that matter, or anybody at the top to do what needs to be done. What can I do, and what can we do together? I think for me, that's the focus at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that you make there. I think coming up to 30 years of democracy and constitutionality, we have to question who has that democracy and constitutionality served over the last 30 years. And we need to relook at whether we have actually succeeded in what we tried to achieve through those processes. And then we have to adjust. And like you say, find the good leaders that we still have in this country and support them through our civil society organizations, because I think civil society remains the greatest hope for a just and dignified South Africa. So we shouldn't lose hope or sight of that with all the negative things that we have to face daily in this country. I'm going to end off with this final question. This has been extremely amazing having this conversation with you. Um, but the final question might hit you a bit offside, as some would say, but I'm going to put it out there because I think it's something that I hold as important that needs to be said out loud. So Biko and others like Biko, Rick Turner, and now also understanding Donald Woods, Rosina Mart, um, has been people that have been actively working towards this anti-racist concept, which you've just mentioned, and this idea specifically from these older writers or this past writers were that the claim that white people are making today that they did not know what apartheid was and how that affected black people and how they are the beneficiaries of that apartheid intergenerational wealth, and everything that was beneficiary or benefits from that process. A lot of white South Africans would like to deny that, but these authors all made the point that if you claim that you didn't know and that you don't know, it's all bullshit. And now we are in this dispensation of democracy today, but the benefits is still there through white privilege, and like we spoke earlier about the white supremacist system that is upheld through these systems and institutions. Um, in your final statement to the people of South Africa, is it still acceptable, and can it be a form of argument from white people that they did not know? And I'll add one more to that. F.W. de Klerk said this to me. I don't know if you remember the first social justice conference that Thuli Madonsela had. I think you were there, but I said to de Klerk, when are you white people going to realize that we will not accept or tolerate your nonsense from the past anymore in this country? And he said to me very angrily from the stage, how many more times must we apologize for apartheid? So we couldn't care less about the apology. We want the reparations, the transference of the land, and we want justice for black people in this country. So is it still acceptable that white people can plead ignorance in this day and age?
I mean, this again, it's a big theme, an important theme. To be short, I think it's highly problematic that people claim unknowing or ignorance. It's a form of socialized, conditioned unknowing. So it's not ignorance. It's a kind of a way in which people conveniently, and I include myself sometimes, selectively focus on certain things and not really face the realities of the bigger situation. And so for me, there's a very clear moral statement to be made about the unacceptability of white people claiming that we don't know or we didn't know. From a facilitation point of view, the challenge is how do we work with that lack of willingness to face and this kind of denialism that's so deeply rooted. And that, I think, is a separate conversation, is that I mean, when you're faced with people who say we didn't know or we don't know, in addition to morally judging that or making a very strong political statement about it, how do we change that behavior, especially with young people? And for me, there seems to be a challenge to say, how do we get people to a point where they see themselves as a member of a dominant group and not just as an individual? So the shift from individual consciousness to systemic, locating yourself as an implicated subject within a system of oppression. There's a bit of a journey that I see in my own life. It didn't happen overnight. It took time. And I think we need this kind of facilitated spaces, mostly perhaps white work spaces. I can't ask you to do that work, but I think there is a need to take people on a journey to come to that point of facing their denialism, our limited awareness. And that's a facilitation challenge that I think is different from the moral and the political clarity that I think we also need.
Yeah. Well, Alam, thank you very much for your time. I think something popped in my mind, and I thought I'm going to be naughty now and just throw a little naughty one out there. I wanted to check if you're still allowed to travel to Orania, or have you now formally been banned?
No, this is where Orania, again, this is a conversation, but there's actually family there. I mean, Orania basically has an anti-black wing and a sort of pro-Afrikaner culture wing. And my family see themselves as part of the kind of Afrikaner culture wing. And those two wings actually don't get along within Orania, by the way. But I'm okay if in terms of the white kind of Afrikaner cultural family connection, that actually there's some family there that are quite welcoming, and who are willing to engage across the racial divide, but they just want their own kind of cultural space. But then you've got the explicit anti-black racist component, and there I'm definitely not welcome.
Well, it's good to know we have something more in common. Both of us probably not welcome in Orania. My people, this has been an amazing conversation. Willem, again, thank you very much, not just for availing yourself and the time, but also for always being willing to speak about the things that people, especially white people, find difficult to speak about in this country. So we appreciate you and we appreciate your time. And then for all of you, the book is out there, Verwoerd, My Journey Through Family Betrayals. It's an amazing book. It's well written and you'll really enjoy it. And you'll get a little bit closer to some of the questions you had about Wilhelm, but also his relationship to his family. So until next time, keep up the good work and keep on fighting for justice.
Thank
Enjoy.
you. Thank you.